when my older brother Julian walked into my kitchen, wiping grease from his knuckles with my favorite dish towel, and casually mentioned my wife was sorting things out in a garage, I saw the reflection of her distinct diamond pendant hanging out of his back pocket. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I just took a slow sip of my black coffee, nodded politely, and walked upstairs to my home office to pull the hidden security server logs. 72 hours later, their world collapsed and they never saw it coming. My name is Thomas. For 34 years, I played a very specific, carefully curated role in my family. I was the shock absorber, the quiet, reliable engine in the background that everyone expected to run smoothly while they took a sledgehammer to the chassis. I built a highly successful logistics firm from the ground up, working 80-hour weeks in my 20s while my peers were out finding themselves. My older brother, Julian, on the other hand, was the hood ornament, the undisputed golden child of the family. Julian was a 36-year-old visionary, which is simply the polite, Midwestern family term for a man who burned through our parents' retirement fund on failed crypto startups and then casually moved on to draining mine. I paid off his maxed-out credit cards. I bailed him out of broken commercial leases. Why? Because that's what a good brother does. At least, that's the toxic narrative my mother had drilled into my skull since I was 7 years old. You're the strong one, Tommy. You have a gift for making money. Be patient with him. He just needs a little runway. When I met my wife, Claire, 5 years ago, I genuinely believed I had finally found my sanctuary. She was a corporate architect, sharp, stunning, and seemingly completely insulated from the toxic radiation of my family dynamics. For the first 3 years of our marriage, she was my absolute anchor. I bought us a beautiful 4-bedroom colonial on a quiet cul-de-sac. We took lavish trips to Tuscany and Santorini. I gave her a life of complete, unshakable stability. But slowly the anchor turned into a chain. It didn't happen overnight. It never does. It started with small, almost imperceptible shifts in loyalty. Claire began agreeing with my mother about Julian's so-called potential. She started taking his side during Sunday dinners when he'd make passive-aggressive comments about my boring, predictable, corporate lifestyle. He just needs a break, Thomas, she would whisper to me in the car ride home, the streetlights reflecting off her face as she looked out the window. You have so much. You're so comfortable in your little empire. Why do you have to be so rigid with him? In the 6 months leading up to that Sunday afternoon, the atmosphere in my own house had grown remarkably thick. A subtle, suffocating pressure settled into the walls. Claire started taking private phone calls in the guest room, her voice dropping to a hushed, frantic whisper whenever I walked past the door. Julian started dropping by unannounced in the middle of the day to borrow tools or ask for advice, even though he never actually listened to a single word I said. They developed an inside joke, a shared, knowing look across the dining table that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The audacity of it all was staggering, yet I kept my mouth shut. I observed. I cataloged everything. Which brings us to that Sunday. I was supposed to be in Chicago for a 3-day supply chain logistics conference. I had kissed Claire goodbye at 5 in the morning, taking an Uber to the airport in the pouring rain. But a massive line of severe thunderstorms grounded all departing flights. After sitting at the gate for 6 agonizing hours, the airline canceled the route entirely. I didn't bother calling Claire. I just grabbed a cab back to the suburbs, exhausted, figuring I'd surprise her, order some takeout, and get some paperwork done in my office. The house was dead silent when I unlocked the front door. No music playing. No television humming. I dropped my overnight bag by the stairs, the thud echoing slightly in the open foyer. That's when Julian walked out of the hallway leading to the garage. He looked flushed. Sweat beaded at his temples. He was hurriedly zipping up his light jacket, his breathing slightly shallow. He froze for a fraction of a second when he saw me, a flash of genuine panic crossing his eyes before the arrogant, golden child smirk slid right back onto his face. "Hey, little bro," he said, his voice entirely too loud for the quiet house. "Didn't expect you back so soon. Flight get delayed?" Before I could answer, he walked past me toward the kitchen, grabbing my favorite dish towel to wipe his hands. "Your wife's in the garage, sorting some old boxes. I was just helping her move some heavy stuff around." As he turned his back to toss the towel onto the counter, my blood ran cold. Sticking out of his back denim pocket was a silver chain, attached to a very distinct, custom-made teardrop diamond pendant. The exact pendant I had bought Claire for our 3rd anniversary. The one she swore she never took off. He patted my shoulder as he walked past me toward the front door. "See you at Mom's next week, Tommy." The front door clicked shut. For years, I had convinced myself that absorbing their disrespect was a sign of maturity. I truly thought that by not reacting to Julian's blatant entitlement or Claire's creeping disdain, I was being the bigger person. But here is the psychological truth about family systems that run on dysfunction. Keeping the peace is nothing more than slow self-destruction with a polite name. When you constantly mute your own instincts to make sure a narcissist or an entitled sibling doesn't throw a tantrum, you aren't actually creating peace. You are just paying for their comfort with your own sanity. You are teaching them that your boundaries are entirely negotiable, and that your self-respect is a cheap currency they can spend whenever they want. I had let them gaslight me into believing my intuition was paranoia. I didn't go into the garage to confront her. I didn't need to. Instead, I walked quietly upstairs, locked the heavy oak door to my office, and opened the encrypted cloud folder containing the footage from the hidden security cameras I had installed in the garage and driveway 3 months prior. And what I found inside those video files changed everything I thought I knew about the past 5 years. What I've told you so far is how they broke me down. What comes next is how I stopped feeling and started calculating. The security footage wasn't just a betrayal of vows. It was a masterclass in financial predation. I sat in my dimly lit office, staring at my dual monitors, watching the black and white feed from the camera hidden behind the garage utility shelving. I watched my older brother and my wife. I watched the physical infidelity, the rushed, messy reality of their affair playing out among the cardboard boxes of our life. I saw her unclip her diamond pendant and hand it to him, a sick little trophy for him to carry. But the physical betrayal wasn't the worst part. It was the audio. I had upgraded the camera's microphone 2 months prior. Their voices came through with chilling clarity over my noise-canceling headphones. "We need to move faster," Jules, Claire's voice echoed off the concrete walls. She was buttoning her blouse, her tone purely transactional. "Thomas is getting suspicious. He asked about the missing $50,000 from the joint savings again yesterday." Julian let out a short, humorless laugh. "Tell him it's tied up in the mutual fund lockup period. He's too busy playing corporate drone to actually check. Once he signs the new life insurance policy and the home equity line next week, the runway is clear. I'll transfer the capital to the Cayman account and you can file for the divorce. You'll get half of everything he built, plus alimony. Just make sure the LLC paperwork is clean," Claire replied, fixing her hair in the reflection of my car window. "If he finds out you're listed as the primary stakeholder on the new venture funded by our equity, he'll freeze the assets." I sat perfectly still. The room went dead silent except for the hum of my computer tower. I didn't smash the monitor. I didn't storm downstairs and demand answers. I didn't cry. I took action. I just leaned back in my leather chair and took a deep, steady breath. The anger evaporated, replaced by a cold, absolute clarity. I had spent my entire life being the reliable bank for my family, the responsible fool who subsidized their delusions. They didn't just want to betray me. They wanted to ruin me, take my life's work, and walk away clean. I didn't know it then, but that Sunday was the last day I would ever feel an ounce of obligation toward either of them. I spent the next 4 hours backing up the footage to 3 separate encrypted hard drives. I compiled the audio clips, enhanced the sound files, and locked everything in a secure cloud vault. When I finally walked downstairs, Claire was in the kitchen, casually chopping vegetables for a salad. She turned, giving me a bright, practiced smile. "Oh, you're back. Julian said your flight got delayed." I was just in the garage sorting the old winter clothes. I kept my voice steady. "Yeah, total nightmare at the airport. I'm exhausted." "Poor baby," she cooed, wiping her hands and walking over to kiss my cheek. "Go rest. I'll make us dinner." I nodded, turning away before she could see the absolute void in my eyes. The next morning, while Claire was at her architectural firm, I drove directly to the offices of Martin and Sterling, a ruthless corporate litigation and divorce firm in downtown Chicago. I bypassed the standard family law attorneys and hired a forensic accountant and a senior partner who specialized in asset protection. Here is a critical truth about surviving financial abuse. A document signed before the conflict is your only real shield, and a paper trail is your greatest weapon. People think of betrayal in emotional terms, but divorce and fraud are purely administrative. If you suspect your partner is draining assets, you do not confront them with tears, you quietly gather the bank statements, the LLC formation papers, and the wire transfer logs. You build an ironclad paper trail before they even realize you are awake. Financial abuse is still abuse, and it leaves an undeniable evidence trail if you know exactly where to look. What Claire and Julian didn't know was that my business wasn't a standard S Corp, and the house we lived in wasn't actually a joint marital asset. 3 years before I met Claire, my mentor advised me to place my core logistics firm and my primary real estate into a blind trust, heavily insulated by a multi-tiered LLC structure, re-registered in Delaware. Claire thought she was entitled to half my net worth because my name was on the mortgage bills we received in the mail. She was completely unaware that I was essentially a tenant in my own home, paying rent to a trust that she had absolutely no legal claim to. Over the next 10 days, I moved like a ghost in my own life. I smiled at Claire over breakfast. I attended Sunday dinner at my mother's house, watching Julian brag about his mysterious new offshore venture while I calmly ate my roast beef. I played the role of the oblivious, overworked husband flawlessly. Behind the scenes, my legal team was busy freezing every joint credit card, redirecting all my liquid capital into protected escrow accounts, and drafting a devastating series of legal notices. By Thursday, my forensic accountant uncovered the extent of Julian's theft. Claire had quietly forged my signature to authorize over $80,000 in wire transfers to Julian's shell company over the past 8 months. It wasn't just infidelity. It was wire fraud. It was a federal crime. I had everything I needed. The trap was fully set, the steel jaws pulled back and waiting. I let them enjoy their false victory. I watched them whisper, entirely oblivious to the fact that their carefully constructed reality was already dead. And what happened next, the exact way I chose to drop the match, is a moment they will never, ever forget. That was the setup. Now here is where I stopped being patient and started being precise. My mother always hosted a lavish Sunday dinner on the last weekend of the month. It was a mandatory command performance for the entire extended family, held in her overly decorated formal dining room. I arrived exactly 40 minutes late. I had planned to be perfectly on time, but the private process server I hired to deliver the final, notarized eviction notices to Claire ran into a delay at the county courthouse. I sat in my parked car outside a corner pharmacy, the engine idling, waiting for his encrypted text message confirmation. I thought I was entirely ready for that moment. I wasn't, not entirely. My chest felt incredibly tight, and my hands were gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles legitimately ached. There is a massive, suffocating psychological friction to blowing up your own life, even when you know it's completely necessary. But my phone buzzed with the confirmation. I took a slow, deep breath, grabbed the thick leather portfolio from the passenger seat, and finally walked through the heavy front door. They were all gathered around the long mahogany table. My mother, 2 of my aunts, Claire, and Julian. Julian was sitting near the head of the table, exactly where my late father used to sit, acting like he was the undisputed patriarch of the family. Julian leaned back in his chair, swirling a glass of expensive Cabernet, looking incredibly smug as I walked into the room. "Nice of you to finally join us, Tommy. We were just talking about my new holding company and how fast the capital is rolling in. You know, if you weren't so terrified of risk, you might actually enjoy life instead of just funding it for the rest of us." I didn't argue. I didn't defend my career or my choices. I just walked directly over to his chair, unclasped my portfolio, and slid a heavy, bound legal dossier directly onto the center of the table. The top pages were glossy, high-resolution prints from the garage camera, followed immediately by the forensic accountant's trace of the $80,000 in fraudulent wire transfers and the draft of the federal criminal complaint. Julian reached for the folder, his arrogant smirk still plastered on his face, clearly expecting some kind of tedious corporate ledger. He flipped it open. He didn't scream. He didn't shout. He just sat there, very still, reading the first page twice. Their faces drained of color in absolute unison. Julian's posture collapsed inward, his eyes darting frantically between the image of his hands on my wife in our garage and the undeniable bank logs proving he had committed wire fraud. That silence, that utter paralysis as his brain desperately tried to find a lie that could save him, was worse than any dramatic outburst. My mother dropped her heavy silver fork against her porcelain plate with a sharp clatter, her mouth falling open as she caught sight of the photos. The room went dead silent. I kept my voice steady. You have exactly 72 hours to return the funds to my escrow account, or this entire packet goes directly to the FBI. In that profound, breathless silence, looking at the golden child completely stripped of his armor, the reality of my life finally made sense. Watch a narcissist lose their narrative control, and you will learn everything you need to know about them. We are conditioned to believe that setting boundaries or exposing abusers is an act of aggression. But boundaries are simply a clear description of what you will and will not accept in your life. Enforcing them is not cruelty, it is absolute clarity. You cannot reason with someone who actively benefits from misunderstanding you. The people who scream the loudest about family loyalty have almost always done the least to earn it. Leaving quietly, legally, and permanently is the most powerful thing you can do. I didn't wait for a response. I didn't need to hear their pathetic excuses or watch them scramble to deflect the blame. I turned on my heel, walked out the front door, and drove back to my perfectly empty house. I packed my bags in the quiet sanctuary of my bedroom, moving with a calm, mechanical efficiency. I did not leave a single document, photograph, or trace of my existence behind in that space. Everything I truly valued had already been quietly and systematically relocated. The house felt entirely hollow, permanently stripped of its dangerous daily illusions. I had secured a high-rise luxury apartment downtown the previous week, completely untraceable to my current residential addresses. The marital home, technically owned by my blind trust, was now entirely locked down by my legal team. Claire's personal belongings had been neatly boxed up by a premium moving company I hired that morning and placed on the front porch under a heavy waterproof tarp. I drove into the city as the sun began to set, the skyline glowing in the distance. I poured myself a glass of bourbon, standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows of my new apartment, watching the city lights flicker against the night sky. The adrenaline was slowly draining from my system, replaced by a cold, hollow exhaustion. I had won. I had executed the plan flawlessly. I had severed the financial arteries they relied on, exposed their affair to the entire family, and trapped my brother in a federal fraud corner he could never scheme his way out of. It was a masterpiece of legal and emotional detachment. I knew a massive smear campaign was inevitably coming, but for the first time in my entire life, I truly did not care about their opinions. But if you think that was the end of it, you have never actually dealt with a cornered parasite. What I found out the next morning proved that Julian wasn't just a thief. He was desperate, and desperate people make catastrophic mistakes. Walking out of that room felt like victory. But the next 72 hours taught me what victory actually costs. A cornered narcissist, stripped of their narrative control and financial supply, is the most dangerous version of themselves. I thought Julian would spend the weekend frantically calling lawyers or trying to liquidate whatever remaining assets he had hidden. I severely underestimated his sheer, unadulterated entitlement. At 2 o'clock on Tuesday morning, the secure alarm application on my phone triggered a proximity alert. I sat up in my new downtown apartment, the harsh blue light of the screen illuminating the dark bedroom, and tapped the notification. The live feed from my former residence loaded slowly. The connection kept buffering, jumping in disjointed, pixelated frames. I only caught fragments, but I saw enough. Julian wasn't hiding. He was standing on my back patio, holding a heavy steel crowbar. Claire was standing a few feet behind him, her arms crossed tight against the chill of the night, looking frantically over her shoulder. They had assumed that because I had left the physical house, my security system was somehow dormant. They thought they could break in, access my physical desktop tower, and destroy the original video files, entirely oblivious to the fact that the entire network was cloud-based. Julian swung the crowbar, shattering the tempered glass of the back French doors. The sound of the alarm didn't blare immediately. I had programmed it to a silent police dispatch to prevent intruders from fleeing. I watched him climb through the broken glass, tearing through my pristine home office, pulling drawers off their tracks, and smashing my empty computer monitors onto the hardwood floor. It took the police a completely agonizing 22 minutes to arrive. I sat in my apartment, my heart hammering against my ribs, watching him destroy the sanctuary I had worked so hard to build. That was the imperfect reality of the moment. I wanted him caught, but watching the physical destruction of my past life still physically hurt. When the patrol cruisers finally rolled up the driveway, flashing red and blue lights washing over the front lawn, Julian froze. He didn't try to run. He just dropped the crowbar. The officers cuffed him on the patio, reading him his rights while Claire stood frozen in the grass, utterly speechless. I emailed the high-definition footage of the break-in directly to the precinct captain before the officers even put Julian in the back of the cruiser. Sitting in the precinct the next morning to formally press charges, I realized something profound about the psychology of family abuse. It is vital to understand the fundamental difference between guilt and shame when dealing with toxic systems. Guilt is the feeling that you did something wrong. It is a healthy, internal compass that guides moral behavior and personal accountability. But shame is the insidious, heavy poison they meticulously inject into your veins to make you feel like you are wrong at your core. My mother and brother didn't just want me to feel guilty for being financially successful. They actively cultivated a deep, pervasive shame inside me for having boundaries. They made me feel inherently defective for wanting basic, human respect. When a narcissistic family system uses your empathy as a weapon, they are entirely relying on your shame to keep you compliant and silent. Breaking free isn't just about moving your money or changing the locks on your doors. It is about actively rejecting the toxic shame they assign to you, handing it directly back to them, and refusing to carry their emotional baggage for one single second longer. You are not responsible for fixing the people who systematically broke you. By Wednesday, the inevitable smear campaign had begun. My phone was flooded with frantic, furious texts from extended family members. My mother told everyone I had suffered a mental breakdown, attacking my brother over a misunderstanding, and throwing my devoted wife out in a paranoid delusion. I didn't respond to a single message. No contact is not a dramatic, vindictive punishment. It is a strictly medical decision. It is the surgical removal of a tumor that is actively killing you. Claire showed up at my corporate office building on Thursday afternoon. She couldn't get past the security desk, so she waited by the parking garage elevators. When I finally walked out, she looked entirely defeated. The polished, arrogant architect was completely gone, replaced by a panicked woman realizing she had tied herself to a sinking anchor. "Thomas, please," she begged, her voice trembling as she reached for my arm. "Julian manipulated me. He told me you were hiding money from us. He made me do the wire transfers. I didn't want any of this." I looked at her, and I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no sorrow, just a cold, clinical observation. This brings me to the harsh reality of trauma bonding and why we stay loyal to those who hurt us. Trauma bonding is not love. It is a biological addiction to the cycle of abuse and intermittent reinforcement. They treat you terribly, systematically destroying your self-esteem, and then offer a tiny breadcrumb of affection or normalcy. That tiny crumb floods your starved brain with dopamine and relief. Over time, your nervous system actively confuses that chaotic relief with genuine human connection. You stay because you are chemically addicted to the hope that the good version of them will return. But the good version was always a mirage. Understanding that I was trauma bonded to my family's chaotic approval and by extension, to Claire's conditional affection was the hardest pill to swallow. I wasn't mourning the loss of a beautiful marriage or a loving brother. I was just finally going through chemical withdrawal. I slowly stepped back from her, avoiding her touch. "My lawyers will communicate directly with yours. Do not ever approach me again." But the absolute final, devastating consequence didn't come from my attorneys. It came from a single voicemail I received exactly 3 days later. The voicemail was left at 6:30 on a Sunday morning, exactly 3 days after the confrontation. It wasn't from Julian. It was from my mother. For 34 years, I had never heard my mother cry. She was a woman who weaponized composure, using icy disappointment to control every room she entered. But the voice coming through my phone speaker was fractured, hysterical, and completely devoid of pride. "Thomas, please," she sobbed, the audio distorting slightly as she held the phone too close to her mouth. "You have to help me. The bank just called. Julian, he didn't just take your money. He used my signature. He put the house up as collateral for his shell company. They're freezing my accounts. Thomas, he's gone. He took my car and he won't answer his phone. Please call me back. You know how to fix these things." I stood in my quiet kitchen, watching the city wake up through the floor-to-ceiling windows. I felt a fleeting, almost instinctual pull in my chest, the decades-old programming of the designated shock absorber, the conditioned urge to step in, write a check, and save the golden child from his own catastrophic choices. But then the feeling evaporated instantly, leaving behind nothing but a cool, absolute emptiness. Julian hadn't just burned my trust. He had consumed his primary enabler. When a narcissist runs out of victims, they will inevitably devour their closest allies. My mother had spent 3 decades feeding his entitlement, defending his atrocious behavior, and making me feel entirely defective for expecting basic human decency. Now, she was left holding the bill for the monster she had meticulously created. I didn't call her back. I deleted the voicemail, blocked her number permanently, and finally poured my coffee. The legal fallout stretched over the next 6 months, and it was entirely stripped of the cinematic glamour you see in movies. Divorce and fraud are, in reality, incredibly tedious administrative processes. Julian was apprehended by state police 2 weeks later at a cheap motel across state lines. The federal authorities absorbed his case due to the wire fraud crossing international banking thresholds. He was indicted on 4 felony counts. I didn't attend his preliminary hearings. I had absolutely no desire to look at him ever again. My final interaction with Claire occurred in a severely air-conditioned, windowless conference room at my attorney's office. The objective was to finalize the dissolution of our marriage. She sat across the wide mahogany table, her attorney flanking her left side. She looked exhausted. The polished, superior aura of the high-end architect was completely gone. She was just a woman who had gambled her entire secure reality for a toxic illusion and lost spectacularly. Because my core business and our primary residence were entirely insulated within my blind trust long before we were married, she had zero legal claim to my net worth. The $80,000 she had helped steal from my liquid savings was legally classified as marital waste, meaning she owed me exactly half of it back from her own separate assets. We sat in complete silence as the mediator slid the final stack of separation decrees across the table. I picked up my expensive fountain pen to sign the dissolution papers. I wanted the moment to feel monumental. I wanted a profound sense of closure to wash over the room. But on the 12th signature line, my pen completely ran out of ink, scratching uselessly against the thick legal paper. I spent a full, awkward minute shaking it before the mediator finally sighed and handed me a cheap, chewed-up blue plastic ballpoint pen from his shirt pocket. It completely ruined the gravity of the scene. It was clumsy, bureaucratic, and distinctly anticlimactic. But looking back, that imperfect detail was incredibly fitting. A cheap, disposable ending for a cheap, disposable betrayal. I signed the remaining 20 pages, pushed the stack back across the table, and walked out of the building without looking back. As I close this chapter, I want to leave you with a final reality about surviving this kind of profound family betrayal. Society conditions us to believe that the end of trauma requires a grand resolution. We expect the people who hurt us to eventually see the light, to fall to their knees, apologize, and validate our pain. But you cannot heal in the same environment that made you sick, and you cannot demand the truth from people who require lies to survive. Closure is not a conversation. It is not an apology. Closure is the deep, internal acceptance that they will never, ever understand the damage they caused, because their ego simply cannot afford to process that guilt. If they admit what they did to you, their entire fragile identity collapses. So they rewrite history, They cast you as the villain. They tell the rest of the family that you went crazy, that you were cruel, that you abandoned them. Let them. Let them have their false narrative. You do not need to defend yourself against the delusions of toxic people. The absolute highest form of retaliation is building a life of peace that they have zero access to. Today, my business is thriving. My apartment is quiet. When my phone rings, I do not feel a spike of anxiety in my chest. I sleep through the night, every single night, because I am no longer carrying the crushing weight of their dysfunction. I walked through the fire, but I did not let it burn down my future. I just let it burn the bridge between us. So what do you think? Did I go too far or not far enough? Let me know in the comments below.